Hola, hola! Welcome to another pronunciation demonstration video. Today I'm reading some sentences in the present tense, and as usual in these beginner level videos I'll be putting common elisions and liaisons under a magnifying glass and explaining exactly what's happening in daily speech. An elision is the process of not pronouncing a segment of sound that may be there in the deliberate, careful and slow pronunciation. A common example of this in Portuguese is estar, pronounced usually as estar, or even just tar, depending on how casual the conversation is. These segments will be highlighted in red in the video, and a liaison is the linking or joining of words. This is a product of connected speech that allows for a more fluid and smoother flow of sentences and words. Todos os dias is a good example of this in Portuguese. These segments will be highlighted in green and or purple if it's the case that the liaison is changing the sound of a particular letter. By doing these videos this way for you, my intention is to improve your comprehension of what's being said to you when you're interacting with native speakers, and also to explain why Portuguese sounds so different when you actually hear it spoken. So let's jump in. O Ricardo aprende sueco. O Ricardo aprende sueco. O Ricardo aprende sueco. O Ricardo aprende sueco. Final E's tend to nearly always be suppressed, just like in the English words like and take. We don't say I like hay or he like hays. So just like those words, in Portuguese, final E's tend to be almost not even pronounced. Aprende, aprende. In European Portuguese, you would only pronounce the final E if there is a written accent over it, like in the word café or jacaré. Regarding the final O's, the length of the suppression can vary depending on local accent, speed, and how casual or not the conversation is. Eu não almoço em casa todos os dias. 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 So, I have lots to say about the pronunciation of this sentence. First, something interesting happens to the pronunciation of the final S's of the words todos and os. In the standard pronunciation of the words, the sound is sh, todos, os. But because the next word begins with a vowel, the sound now changes to a Z because of the connected speech. This liaison makes this sentence more fluid to pronounce, since the tendency is to suppress the final O as well. On top of all this, the final S from os is pronounced as a j in this case, because the next word begins with a D. Todos os dias versus todos os dias. If you don't liaison these words, you're forced to breathe or pause between each word, and you can end up sounding a little mechanical, or it sounds a bit unnatural. This type of pausing and hesitation with performing the suppressions and the liaisons when you're speaking Portuguese is the type of thing that tends to make some native speakers automatically switch back to English, because you're being perceived to be struggling a lot with the language even though you're not a beginner anymore. Now, let me say this one in a thicker East Algarvian accent to show you what this would sound like. Keep in mind that this would be in a very informal or casual setting. Eu não almoço em casa todos os dias. Eu não almoço em casa todos os dias. So what's happening now? Eu is pronounced just e. Não gets shortened to just n and glued immediately onto almoço. The final O from almoço is suppressed to nothing and runs straight into em. The pronunciation of em in the Algarve is em, just as I'm doing now and have been doing throughout the video, versus em, which is the more standard Lisbon pronunciation. And finally, os merges into the final os from todos and has seemingly disappeared from the sentence altogether. Eu não almoço em casa todos os dias. Eu não almoço em casa todos os dias. Eu não almoço em casa todos os dias. No sábado, ela parte para a Inglaterra. 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 So in this one now, I was making the elisions quite pronounced, in other words, in a very East Algarvian pronunciation. Not everywhere, nor every single time will you hear the ending of sábado run into ella like this, and also the para a won't always be so condensed down in this fashion to pra. So let me demonstrate that again. No sábado ela parte para a Inglaterra. No sábado ela parte para a Inglaterra. Nós não falamos finlandês. Nós não falamos finlandês. Nós não falamos finlandês. Nós não falamos finlandês. Here, the S from nós changes to a j because the next word begins with an N. Nós. The S at the end of falamos is unchanged because the next word begins with an F. Nós não falamos finlandês. Nós não falamos finlandês. That U in the final syllable from falamos can be more or less whispered depending on speed, accent, and the level of the formality of the speech. Vocês vivem no Porto. Vocês vivem no Porto. Vocês vivem no Porto. Vocês vivem no Porto. The same thing again in this one with the final S of the word vocês changing to a j sound because the next word begins with a V this time. Regarding the pronunciation of the final U in Porto, as I've said before, this will depend on the speed or the accent as well. Eles estão em Lisboa. Eles estão em Lisboa. Eles estão em Lisboa. Eles estão em Lisboa. Okay, now this example, we have the verb estar, which in most situations and across most accents will have its beginning E not overly pronounced or even not pronounced at all. So we go straight into the sh sound. Estão. Estão. Eles can have the second E suppressed or not, and that will depend on the accent and the speed of the conversation. Eles. Eles, or eles, eles. Now, if it's someone from Lisbon saying the word Lisboa, there is a common Lisbon accent elision that some speakers, not all of them, do, which is to suppress the I in Lisboa, and they just tend to say Lisboa, Lisboa. Eles estão em Lisboa. And if that wasn't enough, if this sentence were to be said emphatically, they are in Lisbon, the E from estar can get overpronounced into an E sound or even an E sound. Estão. Estão. But this doesn't happen on its own. The S from eles will change to a Z because it will be in between two vowels now. Eles estão em Lisboa. Or eles estão em Lisboa. Nós não estamos em casa. 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 So here the final S of nós changes to a j because the next word begins with N. And again we have the verb estar in the conjugation estamos, and you would also tend to not pronounce that first E. And then of course we have em, which is following the S from estamos, and with the suppressed O of estamos, you would change that j sound to a Z again and link it together. So nós não estamos em casa. Again in fast colloquial speech. Nós não estamos em casa. Vocês vão ao ginásio todos os dias. 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 Here the S from vocês is that j sound because the next word begins with a V. And here we have todos os dias again, just like in one of the previous examples, you would run those all together. Todos os dias. Todos os dias. Amanhã tu vês o Samuel. 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 In this example, a change is happening to that final shush sound from the word vej again. The standard pronunciation of this word is vej, but there is a vowel after it, so we change the sound of the S to a Z to make the connection smoother and more fluid, just like in the previous example. Vês o Samuel versus vês o Samuel. Vês o Samuel, vês o Samuel. I need to say, please don't feel like you have to memorize these elisions and all these little details and variations, because they are natural processes of fluent speech, and you will no doubt pick these up instinctively yourself the more you learn and practice speech. Some of the more extreme elisions that I demonstrated in this video, particularly with the East Algarvian accent, are what make some consider Algarvian Portuguese to be perhaps more lazy sounding or less polished or even incorrect Portuguese, or even to the extreme less educated sounding Portuguese, and thus not worth learning or wasting time with. I, for one, completely disagree with this from the practical point of view of a foreigner who has decided to retire here and is trying to buy their tomatoes and fish at the farmer's market and can't seem to understand a word of what's being said back by the locals. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos of this type. Até já!